Now let's summarize all the things we've just explored when we look at the shape of our land here in Indiana. So in this chapter, we've discussed the rivers and how they've carved out these distinctive valleys throughout much of the state of Indiana. And in general, we have this particular pattern in which things go from the northeast to the southwest, from our highest point to our lowest point. Another thing I'd mention is the Continental Divide, which goes right through the middle of northern Indiana, and all things on this side flow towards the Atlantic via the St. Lawrence Seaway, where all things south of the Red Line flow towards Evansville and the confluence of the Ohio and Wabash rivers, and eventually to the Gulf of Mexico. In an earlier discussion, I mentioned the aeolian processes that created the sand dunes that we find in the Indiana Dunes complex along Lake Michigan. I also talked about the Lesch deposits that we find in extreme southwestern Indiana, another aeolian or wind-created process. And I remember I discussed the role of the westerlies in terms of bringing that kind of that sediment to the eastern sides of these north-south rivers, in particular this area of the West Fork and then along the Wabash River. I also talked about the end moraines from a previous glacier, the Illinois Glacier, and then the end moraine from the most recent glacier, the Wisconsin Glacier, that were formed along that glacial boundary. And then, of course, the subsequent retreating glacier created the recessional moraines that we see throughout northern Indiana in case of up there in around Fort Wayne, these recessional moraines, but also the moraine up there up in the Valparaiso, up in northwest Indiana. Also, we've got this area of Illinois till that was created from the glacier here, this Gray Line Glacier. So this Illinois till. Then we have this area that was essentially unglaciated bedrock and karst topography. We talked about the various sinkholes, karst valleys, lost rivers, and caves and caverns found in this particular area that never received any glaciation, which is why those particular features are there. I also discussed Lake Monroe and Patoka Lake, which are both dammed up rivers. They're essentially fake lakes. This other area, this massive area of till, which is called the Tipton Till Plain, which is named after this box here, which is Tipton County. This is comprised of extremely flat terrain that's also very good soil. And it's also comprised of unsorted sediment just essentially dropped and left behind by a retreating glacier. Meanwhile, this particular black line that I'm flashing indicates areas where we see outwash. Those are going to be those river valleys that have been carved out from the meltwaters of a glacier. But also key characteristic is here we're going to have a layering of the sediment. And that's all because of fluvial processes at work in terms of sorting out the sediment. So we have those distinctive layers. And then finally, I talked about those Kettle Lakes that we find throughout northern Indiana. They're essentially those large chunks of ice that have created depression and then filled that depression with their own meltwaters. So there's our good friend Indiana and the shape of the Hoosier land.